Thank you. So I'm going to jump right in. Usually I don't do this. I kind of try to get to the exact text of the session in a roundabout way. But I want to ask you, I'll start with you, David, what do you think as a writer and a reader and an editor, what makes a compelling mystery? Because this is a genre that has been around for quite a while now. It's all over popular culture. But what makes a mystery work? What makes it compelling?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks again for having me out here. This is my third appearance at JLF, and it's always one of my favorite events of the year. And I went to college in Boulder, and I now live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a professor at Stony Brook University, and I just got in last night. How wonderful it is to be back in beautiful Colorado. So it's wonderful to be here. So let me talk about what makes a compelling mystery. I not only do I write, but I'm also an editor. I'm the editor of Native Edge, a new series of the University of New Mexico Press. And I have a book coming out there. I have a book that's already out, I should say, The Indians Won, a reissue of Martin Cruz Smith's book. And for Akashic Books, I am editing a collection of stories, an anthology called Native Noir, and that will be out in 2025. So I've given a lot of thought to this question. What makes a compelling mystery? There's so many things. I have argued at various other events that crime fiction in some ways is the new literary fiction, because we crime writers have taken up, I believe, the mantle of the social novel. We write about social justice issues of racial injustice. We write about issues that are confronting people across this nation. And so I think, crime fiction is a very, very large umbrella. But what makes it compelling? Well, as always, it's the story. It's the story, it's the narrative, staying up late to see what happens, being so invested in your characters. But it's the other things that I think that turn a good mystery into a great mystery. And that would be unique characters, unique voice, unique setting. All of these issues, these elements combine to make such a beautiful finished product that hopefully resonates with you long after you've closed the cover.
All right, and Margaret, so he mentioned keeping you up at night, and I reread your first Wind River mystery the last couple weeks. I thought it would take me 5 or 6 days to read with my schedule. It took 2 or 3 because it kept me up at night. So let me ask you, what do you think makes a compelling mystery, and how did that play into, because you wrote, I believe, 22 novels, mystery novels. So you must have given this some thought, because obviously you want to create something compelling for your readers.
Well, I think that the first thing I was trying to do was entertain myself because I spent a lot of time writing these books. And so if I didn't find them interesting, I really couldn't expect any reader to find them interesting. But I absolutely agree with what David said. It's the story. The story is the most important component of the novel, of any novel, but certainly of the mystery novel. I think it was John Gardner, the writer, who said, when a reader opens a novel, she expects to find an interesting story about interesting people doing interesting things. And that's what I tried to write in my mysteries. And just concentrating on the story and trying to let the characters come through and tell their own story. So it was a challenge. Every book was a challenge. Every time I sat down to start a new book and I stared at a blank screen, and my prayer was always, don't let me make this dull. Let me make it interesting. And then on a very superficial level, mysteries are puzzles, and we love puzzles. So we like to see a puzzle solved. Also, in a mystery, there's always a murder. And I say always because, we have to get upset about it. We have to get involved. And if somebody just robs a bank, we're not so likely to get upset and get involved. But it's a murder, now we're involved. So mysteries do involve murder. A murder comes into a community. It not only affects the poor bloke that got murdered or the person who did it, it affects everybody. And so it throws the whole community into disorder. And then so the mystery, the story, by the end of the story, we have restored order. And in our world, which is disordered, where we never restore order, it's something satisfying to be able to read a mystery and have order restored.
So I want to pick up on something, David, you said in your answer about mysteries taking on social justice, taking on politics, taking on race. Because I do feel as a reader that a good mystery is so much more, and I think both of you do this well, than the puzzle, which is fun. That's the fun part. But what's really getting you often is the so much more. And that so much more is kind of this canvas for the author to explore what is concerning them. And I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit. I think it's interesting you're paired together because in some ways you're writing the texture, the canvas is somewhat similar. You're writing about Native Americans and land issues and different things that affected the Native Americans in this country for the last couple hundred years and still do. So talk about that canvas and does the canvas come first or does the puzzle come first? Like how does it all fit together?
For me, the concept came first. So in my novel, Winter Counts, and I should say for those who are fans of the book, there is a sequel coming out called Wisdom Corner in 2025. But let me focus on Wisdom Corner, Winter Counts, the first book, not the second book. Winter Counts, I started with the concept. Now, I was a professor of political science and Native American studies for many years. I'm now a professor of English, interestingly enough. And so I've known about these issues, and I've written my academic articles that, a handful of people read, my girlfriend, others, but very, very few. And so there's an issue on Native American reservations called the Major Crimes Act that has been bothering me for a long time. You may know that there is a terrible problem on Native American lands called missing and murdered indigenous women and relatives. Many, many Native women and men as well and children are being taken, abducted, and maybe never seen again. Maybe they're murdered, maybe they're trafficked somewhere. And this, nobody's really solved this puzzle as to why this is happening. But as an attorney, as well as a PhD in political science, I knew there was a law that was impacting this. It's called the Major Crimes Act. The Major Crimes Act forbids Native nations from prosecuting felony crimes on our own lands. We can't do it. We have to call up the FBI. And the FBI prosecutes all serious felony crimes on Native American reservations. Now, that's fine and dandy, except that the FBI is not doing their job. They prosecute about 50% of all felony crimes, and the rest they drop. They let them go, and the offenders are set free. Yes, I said that. The offenders are set free. And so they are free to go out and hurt women and children and abduct them. And this law is a real disgrace. It's a disgrace. And I knew that I wanted to write about that. But there's a phenomenon that's related to this, and that is the hired vigilante. If somebody hurts your child or your sister or your mother, and the U.S. government won't do anything, you might be sorely tempted to hire a guy like my character, Virgil Wounded Horse, who will beat somebody up for a price. And his price is $50 for each tooth he knocks out and each bone he breaks. So you might be, and these vigilantes, hired vigilantes, really exist on reservations. So I started with the concept first. Now, I know a lot of other writers go in a different direction. They start with the puzzle first. But I started with the concept. I knew that I wanted to write about a hired vigilante. And so the story came to me, and then it took off. And I should say that as a result of the national attention that Winter Counts got, there was a lawsuit filed in 2023 by the Oglala Lakota Reservation against the U.S. government, forcing them to provide more law enforcement on their reservation. I did not think they would win the lawsuit. They did win, just last summer. They did win, absolutely. Thank you. I mean, I really believe that literature can change the world. And I'm happy to accept that applause. Here's the bad news. The U.S. government, at this point, is refusing to accept the terms of the judge's order. And they are refusing to comply with the judge's order, and they are not sending additional law enforcement to reservations. So we are awaiting the results of this and to see what will happen. Anyway, I will stop there and turn it over to my colleague here and let her speak about how she approaches this.
Well, I also start with a concept. My love is history. I wrote history before I started writing novels. And I became very, very interested in the Arapaho people who were here. I mean, right here on this land where we are this moment. This was their land. And I became very interested in them and knowing, well, who were they? How did they live here? And what happened to them? And where did they go? Did they go away? What happened? And anyway, all of that led to my writing my first novel, which was not a novel, my first book, which was a biography and a history of an Arapaho chief, Chief Left Hand. And that took me into the Arapaho world. And while I was researching it, which I spent 5 years doing, and this is pre-internet, let me say, you know, I was really in the dusty archives, and let me also say this, they are dusty. And I started going to the Wind River Reservation. I began to get to know the people, began to get to know some of the most wonderful elders who shared wonderful stories with me. So I was just trying to draw them in little by little. And then I wrote several other nonfiction books, but then I decided I really wanted to write a novel. And I thought, well, if I write a novel, it's going to be a mystery novel, because following the advice of a writing teacher from years ago who told me, write what you love to read. And I love to read history, I love to read biography, that's what I wrote, and I love to read mystery novels. So I thought, well, I'm going to write a mystery novel. And I was at a conference where Tony Hillerman was speaking, and I'm sitting out in the auditorium with, 1,000 people, and he talked about writing about the Navajos and how it had enriched his life and changed his life and had given him so much. And I sat there thinking, I could do that with the Arapahos. I didn't have a clue if I could do it. I really didn't know if I could switch over to fiction. But that led me to it. Then I thought, well, what is the concept? It's going to be something that happened in history, because I love history. So all of my novels deal with something that happened in the past, which percolates up into the present and still has to be dealt with again. So, and I'm lucky that the Arapahos lived here. Everything that happened in the West, everything they were involved with. So I can just pick about any interesting thing in history and write about it, because the Arapahos were there. So that's where I start. And the first novel, The Ego Catcher, the idea for that came right out of the research I had done for Chief Left Hand, where I learned what had happened when the Native peoples were placed on reservations. The government sent their agents to the reservation area to, quote unquote, get the reservations ready for the Indians. And how did they do that? They did that by carving off the best lands, the lands with water, the lands with timber, for their own private ranches. And then the rest of it was gotten ready somehow for the Indian people. So that concept became the basis of my first novel, The Ego Catcher.
Did you know about the law David was talking about during that first novel? Because in your novel, there is a native policeman, Banner, but he has to turn everything over to the FBI. And when I read this recently, after I had read David's novel, so I knew about the law, I thought, wait a second, I bet you, does Margaret know about that all along? Because you don't mention that law specifically, but it is the FBI agent calling the shots on who and when to prosecute.
Absolutely. I did know about the law. And it is the federal law, which the federal government abrogated to themselves the 10 major crimes. So murder, rape, burglary, 10 of them. And they said, we will take care of these crimes. And the reason they did it, David, and from my research, is because they didn't think that Native people in handling these crimes that they were tough enough. They thought, because the Native custom would be to have some, recompense and work something out and, and not just slap somebody in prison for the rest of their lives or whatever. But anyway, that was my understanding, and so that's why that happened.
That's exactly right. I don't want to slip into professor mode here, but I'm an enrolled citizen of the Sicangu Lakota Nation, and one of my ancestors is Chief Spotted Tail, and he was the great leader of my branch of the Lakotas, the Sicangu Lakota. We're the Burnthai Nation. And he was murdered by another Lakota, and our way of justice deals not with retribution and sanctions, but with making people whole. So after he was murdered, this is in the 1800s, the elders of our nation came together and said, okay, so Crow Dog, you are going to have to feed his children and his wife for the rest of their lives, and you're also banished from our reservation for 3 generations, you, your children, and 3 generations, and everybody was okay with that. But the U.S. government hated this because they thought that wasn't strict enough, as you're saying. And so they actually got Crow Dog, arrested him for murder, and he was sentenced to hang. But it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court, in a rare victory for natives, because we lose 95% of the time, we lose in the U.S. Supreme Court. But we won one. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, release him. They're separate, independent nations. We have no jurisdiction there. And the U.S. Congress came back and said, oh, yes, we do. And so they immediately passed a law taking away our power to prosecute crimes that occur on our own lands involving our own peoples. It is a true outrage. So you are absolutely right, because there's a different sense of justice between indigenous people and Europeans. And so that's what led to this sort of clash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I feel like when you read mysteries, there are some mysteries where the officer of the law is the main character and they're solving it. Like Craig Johnson's got mysteries set in Wyoming, right? Mm-hmm. Both of your novels, your series of novels and your novel, it isn't somebody sanctioned by the law. It's Virgil Wounded Horse, and it's Father John Mallory and Vicky Holden. And so tell us about solving a crime, but somebody who's not an agent of the law, somebody who's has to go about it, dig in the dusty archives. I'm funny that you said that because that's exactly what he has to do. So maybe we can start with you, Margaret, about how did you decide to use a character like Father John and Vicky rather than somebody who was in law enforcement?
Well, when I first thought, I'm going to write a mystery novel and set it on the Wind River Reservation, my first thought, well, who will be my sleuth? And I immediately thought, well, an FBI agent, because they're going to handle murders and such. And then I thought, I don't want to insult any FBI agents out here, but I thought I don't really want to get involved with all the protocol and all the processes of the FBI. So I eliminated that. And I kind of came to the same conclusion in terms of having maybe one of the reservation police officers or somebody like that. And then I got to thinking, well, it would be nice to have somebody who all the people trusted, and somebody on the reservation that people would go to when they were in trouble. And who would that be? Well, that could be a number of people. But I got to thinking that on the Wind River Reservation, there is a mission there, which has been there since the late 1800s, when the Arapahos were placed on the reservation, and the elders went to Omaha to meet with the Jesuits who were in Omaha and asked them to come and teach their children and start a mission. And so they did. And so I thought, well, this could be my sleuth. This could be someone who, who people would trust, a white man, and someone who has some power. He's got some connections to the outside world, and somebody they trust. And so this could be my sleuth. Then I got to thinking, however, now I've got a white man who's coming into the reservation and solving the problems and restoring order, and I didn't like that much. And so that came, and I started rethinking. I thought I need an Arapaho woman, and I need her to have power. And so I came up with the idea of having Vicky Holden, who is a lawyer, because lawyers have power, and I wanted her to have power. I wanted her to also be a traditional Arapaho woman, which she is. I mean, she had come up in a traditional way and had married early and had had children and all. And then she eventually goes on to school and goes to law school. I wanted her to be a traditional woman, but I also wanted her to have power. And so she's a lawyer. So that's how I came up with my sleuths.
Mm-hmm. All right. David, with Virgil?
Well, Virgil Wounded Horse, again, a hired vigilante, it was a natural choice. So it wasn't that I there was really no other option. When I first conceived of Winter Counts, I knew that it had to be from the viewpoint, or POV, as we say in the writing world, point of view of Virgil Wounded Horse, the hired vigilante, who is most certainly not a government official of any sort. So for me, it was a natural choice. But I do want to say there's an interesting point here. I seem to have been identified with this new generation of crime writers in America. I'm in a group called Crime Writers of Color, and there's a group of youngish crime writers, and I have noticed that we all, or most of us, adopt what has been called a decentered view of crime fiction, meaning not the usual police officer, detective, private investigator, but instead outsiders, as you have pointed out. Now, the most successful of all of these, both commercially and I would say literarily as well, is my friend Sean Cosby, who writes under the writing name S.A. Cosby. If you don't know S.A. Cosby, do yourself a favor, okay? Pick up his books, Razorblade Tears, Blacktop Wasteland. You will find nary a police officer or private eye in there, and yet these books work. They're propulsive. They are fantastic. They create a world unto themselves. So I think there is a movement, I think, to decenter this. Now, having said that, there's a lot of amazing stuff. I love Craig Johnson. We did an event with Craig, you and I did, just in May. And, you know, obviously Sheriff Longmire, which is one of my favorite series of books of all time. But I do think among the younger breed, it does seem to be sort of opening up our protagonists, our heroes. So great point.
Well, what's interesting, though, with Virgil is in Winter Counts, he's not really doing his usual job. He actually becomes an investigator. Rather than just being a hired vigilante, he becomes the investigator of this whole the drug problem that's going on in the reservation. And his approach is going to be much different than a different kind of investigator, right?
Yeah, he investigates. The premise of the book is that drugs are coming on to the Rosebud Reservation, which has actually happened, and so he's trying to stop it when something happens in his own family that's very tragic. So he does investigate, but in a different way. He's not beholden to the Fourth Amendment or, you know, any legal strictures. He can use his fists to find out what he needs to find out. So you're right, he's an investigator of sorts.
There is a problem when you have amateur sleuths. And that is, why in heaven's name would they get involved? Why would they start investigating a crime? I asked a priest that I know one time, I said, what would you do if you ever stumbled across a dead body, which Father John does all the time, and then he gets involved in finding out what happened? And this priest said, I'd call the police, of course. So that always, in every novel, that was a challenge, is why are they getting involved?
Yeah, it is interesting because most people would not, and I think both of you did a good job. Like, it makes sense. Obviously, Virgil, because of who he is, but also the familial situation, is going to get involved. And Father John, because of in the first book, obviously, that gets everything started, is the personal connection he has, and he just doesn't believe who the police are after did it. So it's very interesting. One thing that I find interesting about successful mysteries and crime writing, and this goes back for years. One of my favorite writers that I go back to is Chester Himes, who wrote about Harlem so wonderfully. And his two of his protagonists are actually cops, but that's interesting. But it gives you an arena to being very specific, very authentic. You did a lot of historical research. You're writing about the reservation through an insider's view. Talk about the importance of getting things right and being specific, being authentic.
Well, I can start with that. So my novel is set, except for a couple of chapters that take place in Denver. I found a plot reason to send my character Virgil Wounded Horse and his ex-girlfriend Marie to Denver, mainly because I just wanted to write about Denver, my hometown, And so it was great to write about him visiting a cannabis dispensary and such, But it's great, and it's so much fun to bring Denver into it. But the bulk of the novel does, in fact, take place on the Rosebud Indian Reservation, which is not very well known. The Washington Post gave my book a review, a wonderful, glowing review, and then a roundup as well. And they said his book is set on the fictional Rosebud Reservation. Ouch, ouch, ouch. So the Washington Post could not even be bothered to find out that we are, in fact, one of the 574 Native American nations that exist in America. So I knew that we were not very well known among people that have even heard of the Lakota, or Sioux, as we used to be known as. Probably the Pine Ridge Reservation, the Oglala Sioux, are better known. They have Wounded Knee there, Crazy Horse, Red Cloud. You know, people don't really know us. So I felt a duty to be authentic, as you pointed out. But it was a fine line to walk, and one that I had more worry than any other issue, because our reservation is a very tough place to be. We have 85% unemployment, 85. Right. Now remember, in the Great Depression, it was 29%, and people were jumping off of buildings. 40% of our houses do not have running water, electricity, or either. The life expectancy in the reservation is 47 years old for a man, 49 for a woman. It's a tough place to be. And so I felt a duty to portray that accurately, but I also didn't want to fall into the trap that we call poverty porn, which is to just write about the poor Indians, because our reservation is a place of great joy, resilience, and humor. And so I wanted to write in a positive sense as well. And thankfully, I seem to have gotten mostly good reviews from people on the reservation, and I think that I was able to thread that needle, because it is rough. So I wanted to be authentic, but also present a reasonably positive view of the reservation.
I think it was just critical to be authentic. It's a challenge, and it's a necessity. As a historian who wrote history books, I have absolutely no patience for people who take liberty with history. And so I'm very, very careful. Everything I put in my books, historically, anything that has to do with history is correct. And there have been a couple of books where I had something happen which I had to make a change from what actually did happen. I had, for example, a murder committed in one of my books, and it was based on a history, something that happened in history, and the murder was actually committed in a different county. Well, I had to move that murder into the county that I was writing about, because I couldn't deal with two sheriffs, two this, two that, you know. But what I did at the end of the book was I put in an author's note, and I said, in actuality, this is where this happened and when it happened. And then I explained why I had to change it. For the purposes of this plot, I had to change it. So I think to get the history right, that is just really critical for me. And then also to get the people right and to get the sense of the reservation right. I've spent a lot of time on the Wind River Reservation over the years, and I'm just getting to know the people. I have many friends there, talking to them, just listening to them. What are their concerns? How do they express themselves? How do they express their concerns? I was very aware that somebody in, wherever, England or someplace, might pick up one of my books and read it, and it would be the only book that he or she ever reads about the Arapahos. So whatever impression I leave them, that's the impression they're going to have. And so I want to make sure it's as accurate as I can make it. So what I did do, in every one of my books, I had friends on the reservation read the manuscript before I sent them off to New York. So I had a very dear friend, a woman, and then another good friend, a man. So I got both the male and the female points of view, read my manuscripts. And they would call me after they finished, and I would get these calls like, Margaret, oh my, Margaret, you cannot say this. And I would say, why not? And it was always, the elders will be really upset if you say that. So whatever. But if they had concerns, if they thought I needed to take something out, I took it out. If I didn't get it right, they made sure I got it right. So I was really careful about that. I wanted it to be authentic.
Now they have people they call sensitivity readers. And the publisher, this is something that's probably become much more of a thing in the last 10 years. And it seems like what you did was you were seeking out those kind of readers, 20 years before it became standard practice. So It's very interesting. And I think as a reader, I want to be immersed in that world. And if something strikes me as inauthentic or not believable, I'm taken out of the world. And one line can ruin a whole book for me. I mean, so I think what you guys do is really, it's difficult. I think that's one of the most difficult parts, is to keep your reader 100% in that world.
Boy, and you do not want the reader to get kicked out of that world, or anything to kick the reader, because you can't get them back in.
It's a difficult issue. So I, for a while there, I was getting literally hundreds of responses every month from my readers. Now, my book's been out 4 years. It's maybe one every 2 or 3 months, but I still get reader emails, which I welcome and delighted by. But a consistent theme, I use a fair amount of Lakota language in my book. And a lot of people say, have you thought about including a glossary? And I'm always nice to them, like, oh, thank you for the kind suggestion, But no, I made the choice to not include a glossary because, first of all, I think that the meaning of the term can be gleaned from the context, but also I made the choice that I want to trust my reader. If they really want to know some of these words, they can go look them up, okay? And I think maybe it does kick my readers out sometimes, but I just did not I felt that a glossary of Lakota words might otherize, is that a verb? Might create, I hope you get what I'm trying to say, that it might indicate that this is a language that is that of the other, as opposed to more of an inclusive sense. So I chose to not include a glossary, but I get this at least every couple of months. Somebody say, well, I like your book so much, but I had to stop and look up this word, this word, this word. So that's just a choice I made. So we will see how it pans out.
I mean, for me, that drew me in deeper, because, you're not, your characters are in the book. They're living in the book. They're not going to turn around and say, this means this, or or flip to the back of the book for a glossary. I think in a nonfiction work, I'd probably want that, right?
Sure.
But not in fiction. So I enjoyed that about your book, to be honest.
I agree with that, yeah.
So the topic of this was, what makes a compelling noir? And one of the things I've loved for years and years is my noir movies. And so I wanted to ask you, the two of you, how does a noir movie, or does a mystery in a movie differ from writing the novel? Like, what is the relationship between the book and the screen, and what makes something good in one place and something good in the other, or is it all the same? It seems different to me, but I'll...
Well, I'll keep this brief. I will say, I get asked a lot, is Winter Counts ever going to be a movie? I can tell you that I did sell it to a movie studio. They sent it back to me, and then I sold it to ABC. And they were going to turn it into a series. And I got the green light. And so I'm very excited. Like, people will get to know Virgil Wounded Horse. Yay. I see people clapping, but unfortunately, no. ABC, first of all, I can tell this story now because my contract's over, right? They gave the rights back to me. The showrunner of the TV show Lost was going to direct it. And he calls me up. He's like, Dave, I've just written the pilot for Winter Counts. You are going to love this. We have switched it to Las Vegas. Okay, Las Vegas. It's out of the reservation. And he's going to be in a love triangle between a police officer and his girlfriend. We think you are going to love it. And I'm like, yeah. However, then the strike happened in Hollywood, which you may have heard about, and something in that time period of 10 months of the strike, it lost all momentum, and the rights have returned to me. I am talking with a Canadian director right now about possibly making it into a Canadian art house movie. We'll see. But to answer right now I'm a little jaded on the whole film thing, okay, to be honest, because it's 2 times I've had something happen and it's fallen flat. What makes a good noir? So I wrote my MFA thesis on noir fiction. A true noir novel or film, the main character is an anti-hero and always comes to a bad end. So I wrote Winter Counts first as a true noir short story, and Virgil Wounded Horse dies at the end of that story. Because that's what has to happen in a noir. Like the classic noir is The Killer Inside Me by Jim Thompson. But then I liked Virgil so much. I mean, that story is still floating around. You can find it. It was published in Native American literary journal called Yellow Medicine Review. But I liked the character so much, I resurrected him. And I decided I'm going to write it as a thriller because I want Virgil to come back. So a true noir, I mean, the true noirs of the 40s and 50s, they're so dark and beautiful in their tragic overtones. But that's not exactly where I'm going here. But let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think that's right. A true noir, it's the good man, the sleuth, is walking down the dark streets alone into danger, and everything is dark. And in the films, which I love to watch, everything is dark and shadowy. And I write about the Wind River Reservation, where the sun shines all the time. It's actually beautiful. I think it's a beautiful place in a very stark way, but I think it's beautiful. And so do the Arapaho people, incidentally. They think it's beautiful. So I remember talking about your experience here, Tony Hillerman saying, when you sell a book to the movies, just cash the check and go your way, because they are going to do whatever they darn well want to do with your story. So my books have been optioned, but nothing has come out of it yet, so I don't know if it ever will, and frankly, I don't care. But anyway, they're two different art forms. Film is different, and I think to translate a book into a movie, that takes some skill. That takes some writers with some real skill. Where you in a book, you're setting a scene, you can go on for pages. And in a movie, it's going to take place in a second. So it's just two different, completely different art forms. And I think it'd be fun. I think it'd be fun to see what somebody else would do with one of my stories. But I'd probably be cringing a lot too, I guess.
So your heroes, Virgil, and let's talk about Father John Mallory. They're flawed people. And how critical is that to the telling of the story? Let's start with Father John Mallory. He's a Jesuit priest. He's got that logic of the Jesuits behind him. But he also has a pretty bad alcoholic past behind him. Mm-hmm. And he has a lot of self-doubt, at least early on. So talk about why was that critical, and what does that add to the story?
Well, for me, it made him more real. When I first got the idea to write about this, my sleuth would be this man that people would trust and would come to and, would know that he was going to help them. And so I started writing The Yucca Catcher, and I was, a few chapters in. And this guy was so boring. I thought I was going to die. Well, I thought I was going to have to kill him, is what I thought. I said, I cannot go any further with this guy. So I had to stop and back off, and think, wait a minute. He's a human being. And I haven't met anybody who's perfect yet. Well, maybe you guys. But, most of us are not. We all have our flaws, and we have our demons, and we have the things that we're living with, and we're trying to overcome and grow from and all that kind of thing. And so I got to think, well, what about him? What could be his demons, his flaws? And I thought, well, he is an Irishman. I'm of Irish descent. So I thought, well, maybe he has a little bit of trouble with the drink. And once I gave him that little bit of trouble, he came alive. He just came alive for me. Then he was real. He was like the rest of us. He was struggling. He struggles every day. He struggles all the time. But he keeps struggling. So it was crucial for me to come up with that idea that he did have faults. He's not perfect. And it's his faults that make him interesting, I think. It was interesting, at least to me, to write about him.
And Virgil, he's a guy, as you said, he'll knock your tooth out for $50, which may be inflation, maybe 75. but obviously he's got something going on.
Well, all great fiction starts with a flawed protagonist, a hero, really. Think about Lear, think about Gatsby. You've got to have that. That's the hero's journey. Can they overcome, can they find some redemption? Or if it's noir, if it's a tragedy, they don't. And that's indeed the tragic aftermath if they didn't accept their flaws. But I think in crime fiction, we especially want to build in certain flaws in our characters and our heroes, our protagonists, to bring them to life. Virgil is certainly flawed. Now, Virgil has had a problem with alcohol, but he did not take a drink. He stopped all substances, and you will never see him take a drink in any of the books that I write, because I chose not to write into that stereotype for Native Americans. So I made that choice. There is a chapter, thank you. There is a chapter in Winter Counts where he's sorely tempted. He's in a bar in Denver, and he's got a beer and a shot. And he is tempted, and he's almost about to drink it, but then he has a flashback, and he remembers the last time he smells the beer, and he remembers this actually happened. A child froze to death on the Rosebud Reservation because somebody got drunk and left their child outside in a car. And he came into the house and smelled the beer. And so he stops. He's like, no. He pushes the beer away. So he's flawed there, but he's flawed in another way. He, as a vigilante that beats people up for a living, for hire, he starts to like it. He starts to, not just for justice, but he starts to like the beatings. And at one point he muses. It's like, I realize I'm liking this too much, and I'm getting away from the justice and the harmony of we have a word, Matakio Yasin, we're all related in Lakota, and he gets away from that, and he thinks, but what am I supposed to do? There are no 12-step programs for hired vigilantes. And so but here's the really funny thing. There's a great book, I hope you have it at the Boulder Bookstore. So a friend of mine, Rob Hart, H-A-R-T, he reads my book, and I'm not saying he took the idea from me, I'm sure it was bubbling around, but his new book, I blurbed it, it's called Assassins Anonymous, and it's about that. It's about a hired killer who is going to a 12-step program for hired assassins. And it is honestly one of the funniest and best books that I've read in a long time, because he's trying so hard not to kill any more people. He's really, really trying. So anyway, so Virgil is very, very flawed. I will share with you that in the sequel, Wisdom Corner, he is flawed. He remains flawed, but he's stopped being a vigilante, but he gets dragged back into it because of the death of one of the main characters, whom I won't reveal. The book does deal a lot with Native American spirituality. The new book, which if you don't know, it was made a criminal offense in America until the year 1978. People are not aware of this, that our religion, our spirituality was outlawed and made a felony crime that you could go to prison for, until the year 1978. It's really outrageous. So that is one of the central themes of the new book.
All right, thank you. I think we're ready to head towards audience questions here. And there'll be people passing around mics, so if we've got some questions. Got a couple.
One thing I love about your books, Vicki, is that you give validity to oral history and to the Native Americans' way of remembering things that are not documented or two-dimensional. I really like that. My question, I think I've asked you this before, but I'm going to ask it again. Why did you leave the relationship between Father John and Vicki in suspense to the very end? You don't resolve it.
Well, once I had this flawed priest who's a recovering alcoholic, and then this beautiful woman is in his path, that led to other things. I thought, well, maybe he could really have developed some strong feelings for her, and she for him. So that just deepened their characters and made them more human. Why did I leave this relationship, let it go on for 20 books?
You never resolved it. Still at the same place.
Well, I think I did resolve it at the end in the last book. To my mind, I did. When I started out writing the series, I knew how it would. I didn't know how many books it would be. I thought it'd be 3 if I was lucky, but it turned out to be a lot more than that. But I knew how the last book would end. So I heard from everybody. I mean, my email box was full after that book came out from people who did not like the way that I had left it at the end. So, but that's okay. I think that's the way that Father John and Vicki wanted it, and that's what happened. So that's why.
Hi. I have a question regarding the criminal. You spoke about the sleuths and the locations, and you're both very widely read on crime, and I'm very drawn to crime. On a personal level, I commit them all the time. No, I'm drawn to crime on television a lot and in novels, I recently saw a video, a movie that was, I think, on Hulu in 2015 it was called Mass, and it was about the parents, mother and father of a boy who was killed in a school shooting getting together with the parents of the shooter. And that just really affected me. So, as crime writers, you have to get into the minds of the criminal. And I don't know to what extent, that's kind of what my question is. To what extent can you do that? But the other thing is, did you ever consider the mind of a school shooter who is often a teen? And is it not even impossible to get into their mindset? That's my question.
Let me take this one, as it has a special relevance to me. So my beautiful 17-year-old son, Alexander Weiden, is a school shooting survivor. So the STEM school Highlands Ranch shooting in May 7th, 2019, 2 gunmen burst into my son's middle school and high school and started shooting people. 13 were shot, but a brave young man named Kendrick Castillo, a Latino and indigenous young man, just 3 days from graduation, rushed the shooter and took 3 shots in the chest and died, but was able, because of that, to allow a second group of boys to disarm the shooter. So this is an issue that has obviously special resonance for me. There have been, Stephen King actually wrote a book about a school shooter, which he now disowns, I believe. So look, I'm not ready to write about that yet. I did write a nonfiction article about my son and what it was like, because we went to the memorial service for Kendrick Castillo, and it was rough. It was rough. 3,000 people there standing up straight, the casket wheeled to the front of the stage, and his teacher said, Kendrick Castillo won the top engineering student award. He was supposed to wear this on his graduation cap, and he drapes it over the casket. That was a scene that I'm just not ready to write about. It was brutal. But let me answer your question overall. I teach creative writing now at Stony Brook, and I used to teach Regis, but they have downsized their program, and I teach creative writing now at Cedar Crest College as well in Pennsylvania. And my students who write crime, they often want to make their antagonist, their villain, too one-dimensional. And I'm telling them, you need to humanize your bad guy or bad person. You need to do that. Don't make them too one-dimensional. You need to add something in there to make the audience relate. And I tell them, your antagonist, your bad guy, needs to be a dark mirror of your protagonist. That's what makes an effective villain. So I have thought a lot about this. I tried to do it as much as I could, because there are some bad guys in Winter Counts. So a really wonderful question. Thank you.
My villains are not sociopaths. They're not psychopaths. I do not write about the serial killers or the school shooters, God help us. So I don't have to get into their minds, because I wouldn't even know how to begin. So all of my villains are people who are normal people, and for some reason they come to a point in their lives where they decide they have to take a human life. What in heaven's name could ever drive somebody to think of taking a human life? So that was the challenge that I had, to take these supposedly normal people and to give them something in their lives that drives them to come to this horrendous decision.
But it's not a school shooter, a 15-year-old also normal up until a point.
Yeah.
What I'm really asking is, how could you get inside that mind and write about that?
Because, well, for one thing, I always reminded myself that the villains had mothers. they had somebody, let's hope, in their lives at some point who loved them. But then there's something, like in The Ego Catcher, the first book, the villain, his whole identity is based on his position in the community and his family's identity, going back generations. They're the people. They're the top people in this community. This is who he is. This is his identity. And when it comes to the point where this is about to be taken from him, when the truth comes out of what his family was really like and what they were up to, he can't accept that. He can't go on and live with that. So he comes to the conclusion he has to stop the person from ever telling the truth.
Yeah, let me follow up on that, because it's surprisingly easy to get inside the mindset of a really bad person. And I don't want to give this away for anybody who hasn't. I know that sounds weird, but I mean, if you think about it, they all feel that they've been pushed into certain positions by factors out of their control. I don't want to give this away, because in Winter Counts there are two bad guys and two bad people. And if I explain that, it'll give it away for those who haven't read it. But I worked very hard. And indeed, in the book, they actually, Virgil and his girlfriend visit the father of one of the bad guys. And the father does this 2-page monologue explaining about how his son was brutalized and this and that. And it was important to me to try to set that up. In no way, though, does that excuse, obviously, a school shooting or any of the actions that they take. But I think it's important, like Margaret is saying here, to do the work, to humanize your characters and not your bad people, your antagonists, and not make them so one-dimensional.
One of the writers in America that's taken this on a number of times is Joyce Carol Oates. Sure. And so if you want to read something from, I think Tales of the Spider Monkey it was a re-release book of hers, which I think is from the mind of like somebody who commits numerous killings. I'm not sure if they're a serial killer. I read it many years ago, so I can't quite remember, but she has a number of different books where she's wrestled with this question, how to get into the minds of these people that have done the most heinous crimes. And so that might be a writer to look at, I think. Any other questions?
Here's one.
So when you're writing, do you kind of become your characters for a while? Are you like part of the evil guy or the evil person, or the good guy and the good person? Do you kind of get into that? And when you do that? I know there's some books that like Crime and Punishment, the guy's like, how could you even write a book like that, without being there and being that guy? So do you become that? Is that part of what your character is?
All right. Absolutely. It's like a form of method acting. When I'm writing, and I write my books, at least the ones that I'm working on now, are in first person. And so when you're writing in first person, I felt this, I felt that, I have to get into the head of the character, and so I become him. So it really is a form of method acting. It's really hard to sustain a 300-page book in one person's voice. So I actually said to my editor at HarperCollins, hey, how about for the next book if we go in third person? That'd be really great. And she's like, well, your book sold so well. How about if we don't? Okay, how about if we let's just stick with what was working. So I'm right back in there. But wonderful question. I can't speak for all writers, but for me, I absolutely do like a mind meld with myself and Virgil.
Yeah, for sure. I think F. Scott Fitzgerald said, writers are not one person. Writers are many people trying to be one person. So we live a lot of lives. That's why I think it's so fun. It's so much fun because we do become all these people that we're writing about. We do get into their lives and we're living those lives. And I've had people say to me, I don't know how you do it. You sit in a study all day long and stare at a computer screen. You're alone all day, and you don't see anybody or talk. I said, no. I'm not alone. I have all kinds of people there with me in my study. I'm talking to all these people. So yeah, you do become, at least I do.
Last month I interviewed Peter Heller for the radio show, and in his first book, Dog Stars, the main character loses their beloved dog. And Peter Heller said during that show that he sometimes forgets that dog wasn't a real dog. Like, he still misses the dog. So is it time to wrap up, or we got, okay. Any other questions from the audience? If not, I have one last one I can ask you guys. I'm always curious, you talked about it being a puzzle and this canvas maybe coming first, the concept. Do you outline, how much detail do you know before you start writing page one? Or does some of it evolve as you go?
Well, I think we all work differently, every writer, but I am not an outliner. I believe that, I know writers who will write 90-page outlines. If I did that, I wouldn't write the book, because all the energy and the excitement that I have for the story that I want to tell would go in the outline. So I'm not an outliner. But I do a general, what I call a roadmap. I do a lot of walking, and while I'm walking, I'm thinking about my plot and my story and my characters and who they are and what's going on. And so I get a general idea of where I'm going to start the story, generally where it's going to go and how it's going to end up. How all of that is going to happen, I don't know. I don't know until I actually start writing. And then things happen. Sometimes characters do things you don't expect. And Vicky Holden, my female character, is very much that way. She's very hard to control. And she would take off and do all kinds of things that I had no idea she was going to do. And I used to bring her right back. I say, no, sister, you're back here. But then I read an article a writer wrote and said, whenever your characters do that, you have to go with it. You go with it because you see, where are they going to take you? What is coming? So that's how I work. And then and I write. I start at the beginning. I write to the end. I do not edit. I do not rewrite as I'm going along. So when I get to the end, I've got a novel. It is a really awful novel. It's bad. But I've got a novel. And then I go back and I start the rewrite. And I spend a lot of time rewriting and fixing and deleting and adding new things, all the things that you do when you're rewriting.
Like Margaret, I start off with an outline, or I guess you don't do that at all, but I start off with a fairly rudimentary outline, but it changes as you go along. And yes, characters have surprised me all the time, and that's how I know the writing is going well, because sometimes things have just happened that I did not see, that I did not predict happening. What I do, though, that I think is different than a lot of writers, is I think about the themes, the symbols, and the concepts, and even the other writers that I want to create an homage to. So in the new book, Wisdom Corner, I'm looking at the effects of colonialism, and I'm sort of doing an homage to the great writer Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. And so that in Winter Counts as well, I do an homage to certain writers, Jim Thompson and Lewis Owens. And so I work that out ahead of time. So I know sort of the writers that I'm going to be sort of honoring. And that's mainly for the scholars, okay, the scholars who analyze literature. So the plot, that kind of happens as I write. Great question.
All right, I think that wraps it up. Thank you very much. Thanks, Margaret and David. This was fascinating.
Thank you.
Absolutely.